Hi, I'm Marc Aramini, and this is part 3 of my discussion on literature and Gene Wolfe. Today I wanted to talk about peace, but first I want to talk about a few of the critical perspectives that allow us to kind of encapsulate what fantasy and science fiction does. And unfortunately, in the 20th century, most serious critical work has been done on works of realism, right? Where you have mimesis of some form, which is simulation, where it attempts to emulate something about real life. So usually when we look at this, one of the most famous classification systems for the types of characters that you're dealing with in any given work of fiction was put together by Northrop Frye in his Anatomy of Criticism. And in his anatomy, Frye categorized 4 basic types of characters. There's a few other distinctions, but I just wanted to talk about them because they're very relevant to what Gene Wolfe does and to fantasy and science fiction and even realism. One of them is the mythic level. Mythic characters are very powerful. They can influence their environment. They have the powers, for all intents and purposes, of a god, right? Then we have high mimesis, where these are not godlike characters, but they have great qualities. They're heroic or villainous, but they can actually accomplish something to change their society. So, for example, a powerful king, who can act and do something would be an example of high mimesis. Low mimesis, on the other hand, is a character who's kind of trapped by his surroundings, right? And this, by and large, is the feel of modernism, right, and of the 20th century character and 21st, where you have a character who's trapped in his surroundings and really can't influence outcomes at all. They're kind of just stuck doing things day to day. So usually they have no extraordinary characteristics, and they're pretty ordinary. And usually also they tend to fail whenever they try to do something miraculous or try to change things. So a lot of realism falls into this vein of low mimesis. Northrop Frye also characterized another mode which he considered ironic. And I don't want to continue to use martial arts examples for these. Charlie Chaplin and Jackie Chan both kind of dwelt in ironic characters, where these guys appear to be really incompetent, right? They can't quite do anything right. But then all of a sudden, in certain situations, they're free from society's dictates. So, Charlie Chaplin can do things by being a clown that a normal person couldn't do. And this emulates the old idea that a court jester could do things no one else could, right? He could insult the king. He could make fun of these noblemen and get away with it for all intents and purposes. So that's an example of ironic characters. So, one of the issues that I have with Peter Wright's treatment of the Book of the New Sun, and Wolfe in particular, is he tends to take a low mimetic point of view, where he says, well, all these characters seem to have powers, they seem to be able to do something, but really, when you look at the final analysis, they have no free will at all. And this is problematic because Gene Wolfe is a Catholic, right? And this is pretty well documented. And one of the tenets of Catholicism is that there is free will and that we're morally responsible for what we do or what we fail to do. And I think that to look at something like the Book of the New Sun and say, yes, this is just a person being controlled by external forces, is to not take into account the spiritual dualism that is at the heart of a lot of Wolfe's work. So let's move on from Northrop Frye real quickly, but we're going to come back to it a little bit later. I wanted to talk about 2 other types of criticism that deal with fantasy, and this is the work done, of course, by Joseph Campbell. His Hero with a Thousand Faces shows how, especially fantastic works of heroic fiction, fit the same pattern of action, right? You have the call to adventure, the refusal, crossing the threshold, all these patterns that if you wanted to, you could even apply to Dante's Divine Comedy, right? And actually a lot of modern movie scripts, because of that dramatic impact, follow this scheme pretty closely. One of the biggest, most interesting factors of entertainment in the 20th century is that at the beginning of the 20th century, you saw this movement into realism and low mimesis, where you had characters facing real-world problems. By the end of the 20th century, and probably in science fiction throughout that, and in comic books as well, you had this escape factor where you had mythical characters able to overcome all the odds. So if you look at the box office right now in movies, you see all these Marvel superhero movies, and clearly these are mythical type characters with powers beyond what we as mortals have, but they're very popular right now, and it's kind of in direct response to this history of low mimesis, ordinary people just stuck by their position in life and absolutely defeated by it, or at best only gaining victories that were temporary or marginal in nature. One other very influential thinker and critic, Sir James Frazer, right, with his Golden Bough, looked at myths and saw these repetitive patterns. He kind of challenged some of the philosophical and theological ideas of his time because he dared to place Jesus Christ, right, Jesus, in this mythic pattern where atonement was necessary. So primitive man needed to make a sacrifice in order to appease something out there, some external force that he saw as a deity or as godlike, right? And a lot of other works of fiction like Shirley Jackson's The Lottery take this idea of we really don't understand our superstitions, but we're going to do them anyway because it's a habit, and we're just going to repeat this pattern, even if we have to kill someone in order to appease some, whether it be a fertility god, right, some ritual that has to be done. So you'll find some strains of this in Gene Wolfe as well, because he's very much tied to these mythical traditions. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about in Fifth Head of Cerberus was how Wolfe is a symbolist, right? And usually this ties in with his religious sentiment. In Endangered Species, Gene Wolfe has a story called The Horrors of War, and you can really see his religious symbolism at work in this particular story. What happens in this one is a soldier, right, a super soldier who's kind of been bred and is not entirely human and seems to be somewhat mechanical in nature, like a cyborg or android, is fighting a war. And people have kind of used them as cannon fodder. But as he goes along, he is able to, kind of empathize with these other horrors, that's what they're called, right? And he seems to become somewhat human. And at the end, he disobeys a human's order because he believes that he actually is a human journalist who's been sent in to see exactly what's going on in the war here with these human analogs, these horrors. It's very difficult to tell at the end whether he was a human or whether he was an artificial horror. But the religious symbolism in the text at the very beginning, you see this sky and the star, and it's compared to the North Star, right? So the idea of Christ being born in a manger where the three wise men are following the star. The religious principle behind that is that Christ is fully human and fully divine. In this story, your horror is fully human and fully horror. He kind of redeems those horrors to humanity. And he also tends to redeem the humans who've created something just to fight wars. So there's a redemptive feature to that is clear in the symbolism that's expressed. And it also makes sense of what's happening at the end. Because we can say, gee, was he a human? Was he a horror? The answer is, he was both. So now I'm going to move on to Peace, one of Gene's most successful mainstream works. Now, in this book, Alden Dennis Ware sits around in his house, right, and thinks about his life. However, close readings will show that it's a little bit more mystical than even that. Peace may appeal more to mainstream readers because it's a bit less science fictional than most of other Wolfe's longer series, especially written in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So in this you have fairy tales, right, and mythic references being repeated, but religious symbolism here also plays a role. So for example, at the very beginning, when you have Ware remembering his 5th birthday party, which is kind of the opening scene, he wrestles his friend while his friend is throwing apple cores at a picture of Ware's uncle who died in childhood. And these apple cores, right, resonate with all the Judeo-Christian things that apples do. So they wrestle there and they fall down the stairs, and it's also symbolic of the loss of his innocence. And this apple imagery is repeated as a motif throughout the story, where, Sherry Gold has like apple-like cheeks, or a smell about her of apples. So every time this appears, there's a sense of a fallen nature, right? Because we know what Ware does with Sherry Gold after we've read it here. Now, the other issue with Peace is that all of the embedded stories that are told and repeated actually bear on the main plot. So sometimes this is very easy to see, and other times it's extremely difficult to see how they tie in. So just like in the Fifth Head of Cerberus, where that middle novella reflected on what actually happened in the main story, and we were able to apply it as kind of a symbolic rendition of events, Peace does the same thing, right? So there's a story that's told of this maiden, Elia, and she has 4 suitors here. Well, Elia's Greek for olive, and Weir's aunt Olivia has 4 suitors over the course of the book. So the first suitor for Elia, this kind of gnome prince, right? She doesn't like him because his mouth tastes of turned dirt. Right? Professor Peacock, one of her suitors, takes her out on these expeditions, and they go kind of spelunking, right? They go through these caves, and Ware actually goes with them when he's a child. So that story directly relates to what happens in the tale. So does another one, in which a man is walking, and this tale is kind of like a Arabian Nights story. A man is walking, his name is Ben Yahya, son of John. Right? And he peers over a wall, and he sees this beautiful woman with raven hair playing a harp, and he desires her, right? And then his master, Naranj, kind of makes him work for him for 30 years and then deposits him in the land of the dead. Well, Naranj, in some other languages, right, like Spanish, Naranjo, right, this means orange. And Julius Smart, the Weir's boss, has this wonderful orange juice factory, right, where he kind of harvests these potatoes and turns them somehow into orange juice. And he's the one who actually winds up marrying his Aunt Olive, and this orange is symbolic of Julius Smart. And Alden Dennis Ware, his father's name is John. So Ben Yahya, the son of John, in this story, it's exactly the same. It's exactly what happened to him. He worked for Julius Smart for 30 years, and then at the end he's deposited to the land of death. So the opening line is very well known in this particular story, right? Eleanor Bold, the judge's daughter, plants a tree, and it falls and wakes Alden Dennis Ware from his slumber. Well, of course, when you're looking at the traits of the characters, Wolfe likes to confuse identity quite a bit. When we see later that Eleanor Bold starts kind of getting close to a guy named Porter, whose last name is Porter, and at the end of the story where we see that Mrs. Porter calls up Ware as an old man, and so she wants to plant a tree on his grave when he's gone, we can figure out, right, through the blonde hair and the beautiful description of both of them, and the fact that both are described as a friend of his Aunt Olivia, that, gee, Eleanor Bold and Mrs. Porter are the same person, and that the tree that falls at the very beginning of the story is actually the one that's planted over Ware's grave. So we get this sense that all these memoirs, all these memories, are just a recollection of a man who is long dead, right? And these fairy tales recapitulate this idea, because a lot of them are actually about the displacement of the Sidhe and the Firbolg in Ireland. And all these family names, right, these Scottish and Irish family names that have come over here, show this same displacement. And even some of the images that Ware sees when he's thinking about his past, of this golden face peering in at him, shows how much vast time has occurred to where has passed, to where actually America has become something like a fairy tale of the past. So you see this progression through these stories. However, not all of them are as easy to place to the main narrative as the story of Elia and the story of Naranj, right? It's very easy to see through the symbolism. The one that's a bit more confusing is the story of the Banshee, where it actually shows a man who is trying to marry a woman. The father doesn't approve, so he locks him in the barn at night, makes him stay there, where the Banshee comes out and makes him say a name. And the name of the person is that he says is actually going to die, right? That's kind of the curse of the Banshee there. So this story is much more difficult to map onto the main text, but it does shows something about the motivations of the suitors involved, because there are several suitors here. Where is one of them, right, as he attempts to make a match with his childhood sweetheart, Margaret Lorne. The other is Julia Smart, who actually wins Aunt Olivia with the story. And Ware tries to do the same thing with Margaret Lorne. He repeats the same story because he thinks it will have the same result, but it ultimately doesn't. Now, there are other sinister things in Peace. So, for example, we know that he kills his friend Bobby Black by accident when they fall down the stairs. How many other people does he kill in this particular story, right? There's a scene where this librarian and she is actually working in what used to be his family house, but he had to sell it. He's been vacated there. So this theme of vacating the premises, of being replaced, continues throughout Peace. And they go out to kind of hunt for gold because there's this forged book, this forged journal that they get from Lewis Gold that actually shows supposedly the burying point of the gold. And it could be that he has to actually kill Lois. That's the librarian's name. And he's trying to repress this, and he can't think of her name in a later scene. It doesn't actually go over what happens. You just know that he takes a gun away from her, and that he has it later on. So, you know, he's thinking about like a Louis XIV chest or a dresser set. So all these Lewis-sounding names are coming up, making him think about her indirectly. And when there's a knock on the door, he kind of wakes up and thinks, is that Lois there? And all these things kind of point towards a guilty conscience. So, real quickly though, there are a few other scenes that don't quite map very well. At the very opening of the story, he goes to the doctor, where the doctor shows him these apperception cards, right? And he, from all intents and purposes, seems to be about 45 years old at this visit. And he runs into Sherry Gold there. And he says, wow, she's getting a little bit plump right now. And she's trying to tell him something. And it seems as if maybe she's trying to tell him that she's pregnant, possibly with his child, because she's about 16 years old at this time. Now, at the end, when he's about to retire, he goes to the doctor again. And it seems as if, from other evidence, that he's about 50 years old at the time he retires. So there's this 5-year gap between these doctor visits, even though they seem to be the same visit. At the ending scene here, he gets letters from a carnival, right? He's receiving letters from the dog boy at a carnival, and there's a daughter there, this daughter who seems to be a modern rendition of Cinderella. So a lot of these fairy tales were applying a past situation to the present. In this ending one, it's almost as if Cinderella was turned into a modern story. So this story of, Cinderella and her wicked stepsisters is enacted at the carnival. However, there is something else I wanted to read to you from the text here, because this carnival kind of holds a central mysterious theme for the book. So this is where he's talking about hell in one of his recollections. And again, that hell is a country of marshes, cindery plains, burned cities, diseased brothels, tangled forests, and bestial dens. That no two devils are of the same shape and appearance, some having limbs too many, some limbs too few, others with limbs misplaced or with the heads of animals, or having no faces, or faces like those long dead, or the faces of those whom they hate, so that when they see themselves reflected they detest the image, but that all of them believe themselves handsome and, at least compared to others, good, and that murderers and their victims, if they were both evil, become at death one devil. Right? And this is right when he's going to visit the book forger Louis Gold there at the end. So the idea that hell has these misshapen, freakish characters really matches with the description of the people at the carnival. The Cinderella of the carnival there. However, the timeline doesn't match up for that girl at the carnival to actually be Ware's daughter. Because his daughter, if he had one with Sherry Gold, would be about 5. This girl is much older. However, there is a woman who comes to visit the girl there before she's electrocuted to death. And she appears to be about age 50. And it is conceivable that Ware's childhood sweetheart, Margaret Lorne, would be the same age as him and would be interested in this. So the question at the end of the text, right, about whether there is actually someone to carry on in Ware's name or whether he's the last of his kind is repeated several times in the story. One of those is with the Indian treaty that is forged at the beginning by his aunt's at his 5th birthday party, where it's revealed that later on that Blaine is the last of his kind, and that when he dies, all of these lands will return to the Indians, their rightful owners in the first place. So they've been leased to him until the last of his offspring dies. So there's this idea in the text, and it's really about the last of your kind dying. And the final story also mirrors that, where in the struggle between the city and the furbolg, right, a father wishes that his offspring would survive. So he transforms them into a flock of geese so that they can live forever. And then the flock eventually dies out, but as long as one of them is left, the children are still alive. So at the very end, right, they're actually turned back into, human form, more or less, right? The form that they had during their life. And this is the final embedded story here. And I'm just going to read the final few paragraphs. "Little there is that I can do for you," the hermit said. "Why did you suppose your father, who could not save himself, could save you? The time of the city is long past, and the time of geese is passing. And in time men too will pass, as every man who lives long learns in his own body. But Jesus Christ saves all." So saying, he dipped his hand into a bowl that stood upon the table by him, and touched her head with water, making her think for a moment of the calm sweetness of Lough Conn, and then of the wild sea. Then he said, "I thee baptize in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost." When he had said these words, there stood before him Deirdre and her 2 brothers. But time had had his way with them. They were bent now and old, and though their cheeks were red as apples, their hair was white as frost, for they had far outlived their time. And then the final paragraph of the story follows. "I must have fallen asleep. I woke just now, and Dan had gone. It's time and past that I kept my appointment with Dr. Van Ness, but I find the yellow reminder from his office nailed to my desk that I cannot withdraw it. It's time, I think, that I see the enchanted headrest of the Chinese philosopher looming behind me, and I wait its coming. My aunt's voice on the intercom says, 'Den, darling, are you awake in there?'" When he was a child, his Aunt Olivia would make sure he was in bed when he was reading. It was time to sleep when she said, "Den, darling, are you awake in there?" So this call at the end actually seems to say it really is time for him to go to sleep and to accept the things that he's done in life, and that his time is long past and that he needs to move on. The Chinese philosopher, that headrest there in the story, shows the chance to do over your life, right? The man wakes up with this green headrest behind him, and his whole life has been but a dream. So whether Ware's life is actually a dream that he can undo is something that we are left to kind of decide on our own here. However, one of the most powerful images that I wanted to talk about is how often in the story it relies on images from the Green Fairy Book of Andrew Lang, where over and over human characters are transformed into birds, right? And when he goes to a Christmas party when he's a young child, he receives that book, right, the Green Fairy Book, and he's at his grandfather's house, and there's all these images of Christmas, like the Christmas tree, and he sees an image of the Simurgh. And the Simurgh is a bird that kind of symbolizes all this redemptive immortality. And over in the text, all these female characters are described with bird-like features. So when he goes to visit the Gold family at the end, right, it's like aviary, where there's a green bird's nest everywhere. His Aunt Olivia is described with bird bones as she descends into the cave with Professor Peacock, the one who probably is responsible for killing her, running her down, right? There are other hints symbolically throughout the text. So Peace is a very, very complicated book, but trying to map all of those embedded stories allows us to make sense of what actually happens. So even the story where his other aunt, right, goes to a hotel that's opening, and she sees all these lights outside. You know, she's been transported through time, and the visitor from the future sees all these candles from her time and is freaked out by it and calls the front desk down below. So this transposition of time is exactly what's happened to Ware here, where he is talking to someone who has taken the place of humanity, the next step, kind of the same as the city and the Furbolg would fight for the ruling of Ireland, the Emerald Isle, right? That green is repeated in here as well. And the same as the Native Americans in Blaine here, right? They had their fake treaty almost at the beginning. That shows that confrontation between what's gone and what has come. So peace is a very powerful evocation of memory, identity, individuality, and it's well worth reading as many times as you can until you can start to see how all those different parts come together and really create a whole that is much more than the sum of its parts. The most confusing parts, as I said, to actually map to the text are how the carnival actually relates. Is it a hell of some kind? And also how some other stories, like the story of St. Brendan, right, where you have a rat and a cat fighting, and one is human wickedness, and parts of them are getting cut off and running into the woods. Is the time discrepancy in this due to that kind of 5-year area of innocence, where was 5 years old before he started to experience sin and failure? So is that part of him gone? Is it separate from this part that's tormented here? Throughout the text, one of the main struggles is for this resurrection egg that his aunt wants, which is kind of painted with images from the resurrection. Now, the question is, what will this egg hatch into? Because it seems as if it might actually be something real. So I think that the imagery of the Simurgh at the Christmas tree is related to this resurrection egg. And all these bird-like characteristics that the females have reminds me of the idea of the conference of birds, where all these birds are looking for the Simurgh, right, this powerful symbol. And at the very end, it turns out what they seek was actually themselves. All of them together are the Simurgh. And I think that this is reflected in the text as well. They seek this egg, they seek this salvation, and maybe it's there somehow in all of this already. In any case, Peace is one of Gene Wolfe's great masterpieces. Next time we'll be talking about the Book of the New Sun. Thank you very much for your time. Have a great day.